The movie begins with a military mission briefing. The general informs his combat pilots that they are to cross North Vietnam and bomb key enemy targets. The general also explains that the mission is classified and should not let their family know. After the briefing, they are then instructed to watch an infomercial on how to survive in the jungle in case they are shot down from the skies. Dieter Dengler, fresh out of pilot training, sits beside his close friend as they joke around and mock the infomercial. Not soon after, the combat pilot preps for takeoff, but not before a quick prayer to return safely. As soon as the crew gives the go signal, Dieter takes off and joins his air squadron in the vast sky. The 4 planes are side by side, flying towards their target. After a few hours of flight, each plane does a roll maneuver and unloads its bombs towards the targets. Dieter does the same, but after unloading the bombs, his wings get hit. Dieter tries to pull up, but with the damage done, he knows that he is in big trouble. Dieter loses altitude fast, and the plane instruments are all over the place. The rookie pilot then radios his pals that he cannot pull up and prepares for the worst. As expected, the plane crashes and luckily, Dieter survives, but the danger does not end there. As soon as he gets up, he runs towards the thick forest to take cover and evade the pursuing Viet Cong troops. Dieter then dumps his radio and pistol, then cautiously navigates through the vast jungle. While scouring the vast jungle for anything he can find helpful, Dieter finds a sweet potato that he keeps for later. Dieter fell asleep in an improvised bed, and when he wakes up, he first looked around to see if there was anyone around. An Ally helicopter hovers above but at an altitude that could not see him unless he makes a smoke signal. Dieter tries to follow it, but as soon as he goes out of his hiding place, there is a boy with his mother passing by. Soon after, Dieter continues running until he reaches a big overlooking rock. He climbs at it and takes a look around at where he might be. With no idea where he is, Dieter looks up at the sky and sees if any search planes are roaming the vast skies, but tough luck, no American or any Allied plane in sight. Therefore, Dieter continues to move forward into the unknown in hopes of getting away from the local militias. Soon after, he finds a cave with murky water. Thirsty, he immediately lies down to have a drink. But something feels off. Dieter takes pauses and carefully looks up. There he spots enemy militias around him. As if they were just waiting for him in the said cave to trap the poor American pilot. The enemy then pulls Dieter's hair and points a gun at him, and takes him captive. By the time Dieter wakes up, there is a child next to his head playing with an insect while many of the Viet Cong militias are keeping an eye a few meters away. Soon after, they are once again on the move. They crossed a hanging bridge and back into the thick forest. While resting from hours of moving, a helicopter passes by. The Viet Cong tries to shoot at the aircraft, thinking that it might have spotted them. As the helicopter goes out of view, the militias blame Dieter that he might have somewhat made contact with the helicopter, to which Dieter defends himself by saying that he didn't, and the helicopter couldn't see them anyways due to the thick vegetation. But the Viet Goon doesn't believe Dieter says and fires a shot near his ear. Once again, they are on the move, and not soon after, they reach the plain-looking house, which turns out to be an enemy military HQ. And when Dieter was at the enemy's house, one of the Viet Cong goons unities him to speak with a clearly high-ranking enemy officer. After Dieter refused to sign the document laid out by the Viet Cong officer, he was punished by being dragged by a water buffalo. Due to extreme exhaustion and fatigue, Dieter passes out. When he wakes up, he realizes that he's hanging upside down and the Viet Cong troops have tied an insect nest by his face. The militias then spin him around, prompting Dieter to be dizzy. The American captive was too weak to resist or react. After that, Dieter was placed on a neck-deep well. That if he stands up properly, surely, he will drown. Soon after, he is then placed in a hut where he hears fellow prisoners on the other side. Later, when the opportunity arises, Dieter introduces himself to his fellow prisoners and immediately plans on how they will get out. The next day Dieter spearheads the planning, but some of his fellow prisoners have been there for years. They have adopted the mentality that they would never get out alive. Nevertheless, the American pilot has plans on how to get things they could use to escape. Dieter immediately went to an enemy guard and asked for toothpaste, and while he was entertaining the enemy, he modestly pulled out the nail. Later, Dieter sharpens the nail, and during the cover of darkness, when no one is watching, he immediately unlocks the handcuffs using the nail he had sharpened. His fellow prisoners were rather impressed. The following morning Dieter and his companions continue to plan and argue about how to escape together. But to some of the prisoners, being captive is much safer than running and trying to evade capture in the vast forest in the middle of nowhere. Unexpectedly, the enemies come to their huts to inspect and check if they are hiding anything. While a prisoner guard frisks one of the captives, they find a glass shard almost lens looking inside the pocket. Dieter tries to explain on behalf of his pal that it was used for shaving. Good thing he was able to charm the prison guard, and everyone evades punishment. Later, Dieter collected some rice and hid it under his water container. After months of being together, some of his fellow prisoners get to know him and greets him with a happy birthday despite their cruel circumstance. Dieter then divides the rice between friends, and Dieter carefully plans how to get out of the prison camp. While planning, Dieter took a small mirror and held it at the full so he could see if anyone was watching, But when he realized that the enemy was not watching, he was rather excited. Later they spot the guards coming. They immediately cuff themselves to avoid suspicion. The following day, the prisoners are given their portion of the meal for the day. It was barely enough, and so Dieter decided that they keep it instead for later on. Later that night, the prisoners work together to make a hole below their hut. The plan is after they make a way out without the guards noticing, they should be able to find a way to get out of the prison camp. Therefore, in the cover of darkness, Dieter goes out from under the hut and starts digging a weak spot within the wooden wall. The following morning, Dieter comes out to check out the job last night together with Dwayne, his fellow prisoner. Dwayne convinces Dieter that he did a good job, and it is not noticeable. Suspicious of the two prisoners, one of the guards holding rifle warns them to stay away from the walls. The plan is almost in motion, and they only need to decide on the day they really plan to escape. As expected, some prisoners have grown comfortable in the confines of the prison walls and even threaten to shout if someone ever escapes, getting the guards' attention. But nonetheless, Dieter continues with his plans and refuses to give in. Somehow, Dieter manages to convince his fellow prisoners the escape, and when food is served, the whole prisoners are given a plate of worms. The prisoners refuse to eat it except Dieter, who saw it as a good source of protein. Later that night, they could not sleep because they were thinking about the incoming escape plan. By noon the enemy guards enter the hut. Suddenly a helicopter does a flyby, and the two of the enemy guards get into trouble and start beating up the other prisoners. Not soon after, the enemy opens fire, and one of the prisoners cries because of fear. That was the last straw, and the escape plan seemed more reasonable rather than staying like a miserable caged dog. While planning for the escape tomorrow, and there's a guard who hears everything and tries to enter the hut. Dieter and the others immediately tackled them and took action to escape. Dieter takes the rice he has been collecting to feed his colleagues so that they will have strength as they venture out into the wilderness. But first, they started digging. And when they managed to get outside undetected, Dieter runs over to the enemy's hut to get some guns. After Dieter got the guns, they immediately went to where the enemies were, and while the enemy guards were eating, Dieter started opening fire, spraying bullets at the unsuspecting enemy prisoner guards. After killing all of them, he took the food so that they could have something to eat and soon after left the prisoner camp. After reaching a big cave, Dieter explains that the enemy knows the jungle better than them, and for more chances of escaping alive, they should go in separate directions. Dieter and Dwayne go together and move in one direction while everyone else moves in different directions. But the jungle was unforgiving and brutal. Dieter and Dwayne struggle to walk through the thick jungle. On top of that, it starts raining heavily. After days of walking, they came across a river, and they made a boat for someone to ride when suddenly they heard a strange and loud noise. Turns out it's the strong current of water gushing towards their part of the river. They almost fell, but Dieter was able to grab onto something right away. Luckily, they managed to save themselves from a grueling drop that could have ended their lives. Both Dieter and Dwayne lie down to rest on the side. They then took off their clothes, and they saw a leech clinging to their body, and they started removing it. A bit later, when Dwayne falls asleep, Dieter covers Dwayne's mouth to keep him from making noise. Right across them, they spot a man net fishing by the river. They try to evade the man, not knowing where his allegiance lie. And while they were walking, Dieter saw a shoe, and he gave it to his good friend. Long after, Dieter decides to throw the two guns into the river because he realizes that he cannot use them because there are no more enemies. They continue to make their way in hopes of finding some allies. While they were walking, they saw a hut that was broken down, and the two pals decided to rest there. While resting, Dieter hears a noise of a helicopter, and he immediately shouts for help, but he is not listened to until his friend, Dwayne, loses hope. Weak from hunger, Dieter puts Dwayne to sleep and covers him with a banana leaf. Dieter then makes a fire, and he burns the other broken hut so that the helicopter would notice. Not soon after, a helicopter passes by, and Dieter screams his lungs out for help, but instead of help, he is shot. Dwayne wakes up, he sees Dieter as lethargic, and he immediately goes to see what happened, and they continue to walk on. Preparing for the worst but still hoping for the best. Soon after, they see a boy and ask for something to drink, but they run away to warn his tribe, who in return tries attacking them. As a result, Dwayne gets hit and dies. Dieter musters up his remaining strength and starts running away while the hostile tribe chases him. Luckily, he manages to escape. That night Dieter struggles to sleep, disturbed by what happened to his friend. The next day he saw a group of armed men, presumably enemy troops. When the armed men leave, Dieter goes to the enemy camp to get some leftover food. Still struggling to survive, the next day, Dieter sees a snake and catches it. Afterwards, he tries to eat it raw. Then he sees a helicopter hovering by. Dieter tries to get the pilot's attention by waving a large banana leaf. At first, he thought the helicopter crew did not see him. However, turns out, they did. The helicopter then lowered a rope so that he could get up, and his fellow soldiers were pulling him. Just in the nick of time, as soon as he reaches the helicopter, hostile enemy troops arrive and start shooting, but they manage to fly away. One of the soldiers then asks what his name and Dieter responds accordingly. The others could not be happier to see the missing pilot alive despite months in captivity. As soon as they land, they rush Dieter to the hospital. The movie ends with Dieter in the hospital recovering, and the staff greets him with a happy birthday. They then took Dieter out for a ride and surprised him with everyone greeting him. Soon after his rescue, Dieter Dangler retired from active duty and became a civilian test pilot. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more videos like this and help the channel grow.